And you're live, Clive.
It's 5:05 and welcome into a Tuesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. We start off this morning with an announcement from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, that's HUD, and an announcement that they have approved North Carolina's action plan for a $1.4 billion community development block grant to help Western North Carolina rebuild following Hurricane Helene. Governor Jon Stein submitted the proposal last month, and it normally can take HUD up to 45 days to approve a plan and finalize the grant. So with this announcement, the agency moved quickly in its approval. The governor saying in a press release, quote, "This is great news for Western North Carolina. I thank the Trump administration for moving quickly to approve this plan so we can get busy rebuilding people's homes. An action plan outlines the main plans such as providing grants for reconstruction, funding the construction of units for purchase by low and moderate income households, and establishing a small rental and multifamily construction program." The governor's office submitted the plans to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development for approval after getting feedback from a 30-day public comment period. U.S. Senator Ted Budd commented in the press release by saying, quote, "After Hurricane Helene devastated Western North Carolina, we have been working tirelessly to rebuild homes, businesses, and infrastructure across the region." He led the North Carolina entire congressional delegation in writing a letter earlier this month, in the month of April, to urge the agency to approve the grant. Bud continued by saying just last week, Secretary Scott Turner announced that North Carolina had been awarded a $1.4 billion to jumpstart the rebuilding process. This life-changing investment will provide real relief to thousands of families who suffered from Helene's destruction. I am grateful to the President Trump administration for answering our call, acting swiftly, and demonstrating their commitment to our state's recovery. Out of the $1.4 billion allocated to the state for Helene relief from HUD, Housing and Urban Development, $807 million is allocated to owner-occupied unit reconstruction or rehabilitation. That would be single-family dwellings and houses where individuals live. The approval comes after the North Carolina State Emergency Response Commission met Friday morning to discuss the progress made with Hurricane Helene recovery efforts. This is 7 months after the hurricane hit Western North Carolina. So obviously a lot of work there. We'll have some details with Theresa Opeka coming up here in just a couple of minutes as it relates to North Carolina State Emergency Response Commission and details that they have provided to the state leadership and to other individuals. That meeting happening on Friday. We'll have those details coming up here in just a few minutes. This is just one of many federal grants that the state of North Carolina has gone after in the months since Hurricane Helene devastated Western North Carolina, killing over 100 people in one of the most costly and devastating and destructing natural disasters to ever affect the state of North Carolina. We are obviously still waiting for additional details on other federal funds that have been allocated in Washington, D.C. to trickle their way down to North Carolina. A lot of recovery, a lot of progress still needing to be made out in the western half of the state. We'll continue to track the details not only on our website, carolinajournal.com, but of course right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour, where it's now 5:08, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It has been 7 months since Hurricane Helene devastated portions of western North Carolina. There was a meeting last week with statewide officials going through some of those relief and recovery efforts that have taken place over the last 7 months or so. To walk us through some of those details this morning, Theresa Opeka, carolinajournal.com, joins us on the News Hour. Theresa, hard to imagine 7 months ago, just what seemed like it was going to be a regular storm affecting the western half of North Carolina ended up being one of the deadliest and most destructive in our state's history. Good morning, and what did we learn last week from state officials?
Sure. Good morning, Nick. Thanks for having me. So, unimaginable. It's now been 7 months since Helene hit. And what we found out last week, the North Carolina State Emergency Response Commission, they held a meeting to discuss the latest numbers and recovery efforts. And they gave an outline of what's been going on so far. Among the highlights from that, over 6,000 people and 268 pets were rescued from the storm. I mean, that's just amazing, an amazing amount of people. Unfortunately, 107 people died, and there are still 5 that are missing. They also reported that. And one other interesting factor they talked about is over 6.7 million cubic yards of storm debris, or the equivalent of over 660,000 dump truck loads, were removed across 22 counties. The number is just amazing to hear that. So they gave all those figures. There's plenty more in the article, but it was just a good update that they gave to see how far they've come. Of course, how much further they have to go in terms of recovery.
Well, let's touch on the debris. That's also been in the news over the last couple of weeks. We learned that FEMA had rejected North Carolina's request to continue 6 months worth of 100% federal cost sharing to remove, specifically dealing with wastewater debris that's in all of the little streams and creeks throughout western North Carolina. Theresa, the governor, has responded back to that, requesting some additional assistance. It's a lot of money that goes into that the state has had to pony up over the last couple of weeks since that federal cost share has been rolled back from 100%.
Right. And as you mentioned, FEMA, they rejected the state's request to maintain that full 100% federal match for the state's continued recovery expenses. And Governor Stein sent that letter to President Donald Trump last Friday, same day they had the meeting, to extend that cost share for a minimum of 3 months. Because he says, the delays in response, especially from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, meant that the state can only effectively receive 3 months of active debris removal under the original 6-month reimbursement period. There's still a ways to go. So you're right. It was just an important factor to mention that we're not completely done yet with all of that.
Well, and I'm glad you bring that up, because that was noted in Stein's letter, where he said that 6 months worth of work when this letter was sent out, really only half of that work was actually being completed. Theresa, maybe a little bit reading between the lines or reading the tea leaves on all of this, seemingly indicating that the Army Corps of Engineers did not respond as quickly as they could have after the storm. It wasn't almost until President Donald Trump was in office that some of those relief efforts actually kicked into overdrive.
Right. So there were questions last year immediately after the storm. Of course, you did see some responses by the Biden administration, but of course, there was questions of lax response from that administration. We also had, ramping up to the election, you had the Trump election signs and, anything that purported to be Republican election signs, that some officials from FEMA were calling that out, saying that they were told to avoid homes that were destroyed or damaged with those signs, not only in North Carolina, also in Florida as well. So you're right. As soon as President Trump became president, or the days leading up to, things started to ramp up. So coincidence, it's your call to say that, but yeah, it's ramped up, and now we're kind of like a little bit of a standstill at this point.
So I guess the big question is, where do we go from here with all this? As you heard from officials Friday, kind of going through some of the stats as to how things have gone so far. I mean, there's presumably still a lot more to go. Some folks estimating, Theresa, this could be upwards of a $60 billion storm when you count everything into, including lost economic damages and things of that nature. Still a lot that still has to go on out in the western half of the state.
Yeah, and who knows? I mean, that figure can probably go up as well by the time they get done, getting through all the information. With all the work that has been completed, which has been great, they are planning, that commission is planning for the future, learning from what took place, so they could be better prepared to handle any similar type of emergency down the road. Learning from mistakes, learning what now the new ways, or maybe they've learned from other states what they could do better. So much more lies ahead for this commission. But it was a good report. Glad they updated everybody, but we still have a ways to go with Western North Carolina recovery.
You've got a story up this morning over at CarolinaJournal.com. It's got some charts and some other figures and numbers that we don't have a chance to get into this morning. Where can folks get those details?
Sure, they can head on over to CarolinaJournal.com.
A great update this morning. Theresa Opeka joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:14, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time for a look at your commute on an early Tuesday morning. Look at the roadways with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. We have one.
It's 20 minutes past the hour. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Don't forget, if you miss any portion of our program live here this morning, you can check it out in your favorite podcast app, whether that's Google Play, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. Just search for the Carolina Journal News Hour. Tap the subscribe or follow button and take the program with you on demand on your own time. It's the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast. Download and subscribe now. Turning our attention back to some state government this morning, in the North Carolina Senate, Republicans' proposed budget, they would double the sports betting tax rate and modify the tax revenue distribution to universities if their budget is to go forward. Under the Senate's proposal, North Carolina would jump from the 11th to 4th highest state in tax rates for sports betting, doubling the current rate from 18% to 36%, according to Joseph Harris, a fiscal policy analyst at the John Locke Foundation. And I'll note this tax rate is just for the operators. He says, quote, while tax increases likely typically deter economic activity resulting in a smaller tax base, increasing the tax rate on sports wagering operators is likely to have a much smaller impact than typical. Sports wagering firms already operate in 3 states that levy a 51% tax rate, making it inoperable that the companies would choose to shop in North Carolina due to a 36% tax rate. However, we can expect that sports wagering operators would attempt to offset the tax increase by cutting costs or increasing pricing. New York, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island are currently tied for first place, as those states have the highest rate, all of them at 51%. Harris said, quote, it is unlikely that the increased wagering fee would do much to deter betting due to the addictive nature of gambling. As a result, doubling the tax rate on sports wagering operators is likely to nearly double the revenue that the state collects from sports wagering taxes. The Senate proposal would also modify the tax revenue distribution for sports wagering. Under the current law, $8.4 million must be allocated to various entities, including $300,000 to 13 different state universities. In addition to that, 20% of the revenues collected that exceed $8.4 million is distributed to 13 state universities to support their college athletic departments. Specifically, the revision would benefit the universities with their two largest athletic departments, Chapel Hill and NC State, which are currently not one of those 13 universities. Under current law, those 2 universities do not receive any wagering from, or any revenue rather, from sports wagering tax revenue. Under the Senate proposal, the funds would also be distributed in the following ways: $2 million annually to the Department of Health and Human Services, $1 million annually to the North Carolina Youth Outdoor Engagement Commission, and another $1 million to the North Carolina Amateur Sports Association, plus $500,000 in administrative costs. In addition, $500,000 will be set aside to a whole bunch of institutions across the state, including Elizabeth City State, Fayetteville State University, and UNC Pembroke, with $1 million being received by other schools, including UNC Wilmington, UNC Greensboro, UNC Asheville, and Western Carolina University, with $1.5 million going to App State, ECU, and UNC Charlotte. Of the remaining funds that would be set available after the fact, it would be distributed equally among those 13 universities, receiving somewhere between $500,000 and $1.5 million each year. That is any additional funds. That 20% of that set to be distributed equally. Between March and November of 2024, these universities received over $17 million in revenues from sports betting, according to the budget proposal. 30% will be split annually, with 10% each going to UNC Chapel Hill and NC State, with the remaining 10% going to the North Carolina Major Events, Games, and Attraction Funds, with any additional money left over being allocated into the general fund. During the first year of legalized sports betting in North Carolina, which began on March 1st of last year, more than $5.5 billion in bets were wagered. Another change proposed in the budget would require UNC Chapel Hill and North Carolina and NC State to play more basketball games against each other each and every year. That is also in the budget proposal by Senate Republicans, just below some of these changes to the tax rate for sports betting. As we've noted over the last couple of weeks, this is just the proposal from the Senate. Still expecting it to be a few weeks out for the House version. Then they'll conference, get together, and come up with their final budget proposal. We'll track details like this as that process continues right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour, where it's now 5:25, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We are tracking some new legislation in the North Carolina General Assembly this morning that would try to rein in government and add some more accountability. To get some additional details on that, Jon Sanders from the John Locke Foundation joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. John, for folks that have been on our website over the last couple of days, they may have seen something about the REINS Act, a big press conference Wednesday afternoon dealing with that. Can you walk us through those details?
Sure, absolutely. The REINS Act, I think, is a very exciting regulatory reform, and it deals with, it's kind of inside baseball maybe for regulatory policy, but it deals with the fact that the legislature is the one that's in control of making the rules, of making the laws, and they give this power to make rules to the regulatory agencies. So that's a delegated authority. The executive branch runs the agencies, and they have this delegated authority to make laws, basically which are what rules are. It's much more easy to make rules than it is to pass a law. Just because a bill is made into a law, just because a bill is crafted doesn't mean it's going to become law. But pretty much anytime a rule is proposed, it has to jump through some hoops, but almost every one of them becomes a final rule, which means it's a lot easier to create a lot of mischief on the regulatory side. So what the REINS Act does is it would make it where if the regulatory agency wants to create a very expensive rule for the private sector, that the legislature, which has the actual power to do this, gets to look at it one more time and say, wait, yeah, okay, this is out of control, or all right, I understand this is necessary, so we'll allow it to go forward.
As I understand the legislation as it's been proposed in both the House and the Senate, any of these rules or regulations brought forth by any of these agencies in the state that would have around $1 million impact over a 12-month period of time would be open to this period in which it could be brought in front of the General Assembly. Walk us through that process.
Yes, so essentially the REINS Act doesn't want to deal with minor rules or just this is how we're going to do things in our agency. This is how things are going to be managed. It's going to look at things that have a significant impact on the private sector, defined currently in the bill as $1 million in 1 year. So if that happens, they can go through the rulemaking process, but that rule cannot take effect until the General Assembly ratifies a bill allowing it to take effect. That would submit it to the lawmaking process, which requires a great deal more of introspection and discussion among legislators. It's not just a fait accompli, that it has to be looked at by the legislature, which is what we want.
Explain a little bit more about that. Again, you already walked us through the process, what goes on in the General Assembly. We've got bills that become laws if they can get through both chambers that are signed by the governor. But John, as I see it, when folks talk about the bureaucracy, talk about government, it seems like a lot of that really bubbles to the surface in regards to these rules and regulations that come out of these various agencies with very little transparency and very little oversight.
Well, I look at it just as an economist. I mean, years ago, Locke did a study and found that about 1 out of 6 proposed bills eventually went to become law, whereas almost every last rule proposed eventually became a rule. So the opportunity cost of laws versus rules is much different. So it's much easier for an agency to create a rule. There's already a process where the legislature can come back and say, this isn't what we want. But the rule is already in effect in that sense, and only if the legislature takes up all the time to draft a bill, to debate the bill, for the bill to go between both chambers, for the bill to go to the different uh, committees that want to look over it and then pass and get signed, would it actually go. So the opportunity cost and the expectation is the rule's going to be fine. Very few rules get overturned in that process. What REINS would do is automatically sideline any rule that's going to have a significant economic impact on the private sector in North Carolina until the legislature goes through that process and decides this is what we want to do. So it turns the expectations on its head, which is good for the private sector here in North Carolina.
We'll continue the conversation with Jon Sanders coming up after this. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:30, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time for another look at traffic on your Tuesday morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. Good.
It's 5:36. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Keeping an eye this morning on some ongoing election drama in the high-stakes race for the North Carolina Supreme Court. A federal judge this morning is reviewing final legal briefs in the contested Supreme Court election between Democrat Allison Riggs and Republican Jefferson Griffin, with a decision expected, quote, as soon as practical, end quote. As you're well aware, Riggs leads Griffin by 734 votes out of more than 5.5 million ballots cast in that election contest, with Griffin challenging more than 65,000 ballots. Griffin wants these ballots, some of those ballots, excluded under state law court guidance, while Riggs, the State Board of Elections, Democrats, and advocacy groups argue that federal law bars tossing votes retroactively, particularly when voters followed the rules in place at the time of the election. They claim that Griffin's challenge targets Democrat-leaning areas and risks disenfranchising military and overseas voters. Griffin and his legal team counter that by saying that the courts are misapplying state law and that federal intervention would break legal precedent. Judge Richard Myers, who has not scheduled oral arguments and will not do so, must now decide whether to allow the state cure process or halt it based on federal concerns. The Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals has paused the process, and further clarification from the State Court of Appeals may affect as to how many ballots are ultimately reviewed. That number is currently hovering somewhere between 1,500 and about 5,500 ballots. So there are still some questions as to how many ballots exactly are going to get looked at. We'll continue to track those details over the next couple of days and weeks and pass them along to you right here. In some other legal news this morning, North Carolina legislative leaders are asking the State Court of Appeals to block a recent Superior Court ruling that struck down part of Senate Bill 382. That legislation would have shifted control of the State Board of Elections and its appointment powers from the governor, Democrat Governor Josh Stein, to State Auditor Dave Bollick. A decision last week, April the 23rd, favored Governor Josh Stein and found that the bill was unconstitutional for stripping the governor of key executive powers over election administration. The Republican-controlled legislature argued in court filings that the ruling wrongly limits the General Assembly's constitutional authority to assign duties to members of the executive branch, including those members of the Council of State. They are currently seeking a writ of supersedence and a temporary stay to halt the ruling before the law was set to take effect. The Superior Court's 2-1 majority ruled that the law violated the state's constitution, vesting of supreme executive powers in the governor, referencing precedent in a lawsuit a couple of years ago that was named Cooper v. Berger. The judges said that Senate Bill 382 unconstitutionally removes the governor's ability to appoint, supervise, or remove members from the election board, thereby infringing on his duty to faithfully execute laws. In the dissent, Judge Andrew Womble contended that the General Assembly acted within its constitutional authority, since the auditor does remain a part of the executive branch and the legislature can and does have the ability and authority to assign such duties. Governor Stein's legal team plans to respond to an appeal by Wednesday morning ahead of the law's intended effective date, which was set to take place coming up on Thursday, May 1. That is obviously not going to happen at this point. Some continued back and forth legal challenges will go on in this legislation. We'll continue to track the details over on our website, carolinajournal.com, where it's now 541, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Continuing our discussion this morning on the REINS Act with Jon Sanders from the John Locke Foundation. Now, the back and forth political conversation, of course, has started with the introduction of this legislation. Democrats across the state are calling this a power grab by the Republican-led General Assembly. Would you opine on that at all?
I don't understand the whole idea that this could be a power grab by the General Assembly. The power already belongs to the General Assembly. What has been going on is that in delegating power to the agencies are taking advantage when they pass rules that go beyond what the legislature wants. That is a power grab by the agencies of power that does not belong to them. There's no complaint if the agency allows it. If the General Assembly allows it, if the legislature disallows the rule, then they are preventing a power grab. So the Democrats in this case have it completely backwards. This kind of reform has already been working in the state of Florida since 2010, and it's actually very well spoken. It was talked up in the Florida Law Journal. I think it was 2016 when this was first talked about. But what it does is it causes the agency and the General Assembly, the legislators, to get together when there's going to be a rule that's going to be deeply impactful, so that they work out the kinks beforehand, which is the good government thing that we would like to see. Not just we at Locke, but I think we citizens of North Carolina would like to see that kind of working between our branches of government.
Well, you just kind of stole my next question. I was going to ask you, is North Carolina standing alone in this? You mentioned Florida. Is this something that exists in other states throughout the country as well?
Yeah, it's, I want to say Wisconsin has a REINS Act. Florida has had this working legislative rules ratification, which is how our REINS Act would be crafted. And it seems to be extremely valuable. Because of what I said, it causes the agencies and the legislature to work together, and reportedly it's a very smooth process. The legislature has kind of boilerplate legislation for when these rules come up. There are very few rules that actually reach that threshold, so we're not talking about a great many rules that would be affected. So in this process, you would have the legislators talking about it with the agency rulemakers, and then they would bring up this boilerplate legislation for an up or down vote. And sometimes it does get voted down. Sometimes it's repeatedly voted down until the rulemakers can get it right or just decide to back off.
And again, just recapping what that burden and barrier is, any rule that comes out of any state agency that has $1 million impact over a 12-month period of time would fall under this new piece of legislation if it is to pass the House and Senate and Governor Josh Stein is to move forward with it. John, I can't help but think of some big decisions that were made back a couple of years ago out of the U.S. Supreme Court as it dealt with the Chevron doctrine. That was a huge decision that the United States Supreme Court made. It's not exactly the same, but it did have a huge impact on regulatory agencies at the federal level and their ability to essentially make law independently and not be held responsible for it.
Yeah, that was a significant ruling, obviously, and I thought very welcome, because it got rid of the idea that if the regulatory agency says it, then it must be so. Incidentally, the whole idea for the REINS Act comes from a liberal Supreme Court justice before he was a Supreme Court justice. It was originally kind of proposed in a speech to Georgetown by Stephen Breyer. I just remember this. I wrote about the REINS Act a few years ago, and he proposed it as a good government way of dealing with this exact problem. So, President Clinton put him on the court, and so Democrats should be happy with it, I would think.
Obviously, it's something that we'll continue to track. The legislation currently moving through the House and the Senate. We'll track it as it makes its way there and then heads on over to Governor Josh Stein's desk. A great update this morning. We appreciate it. Jon Sanders from the John Locke Foundation joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:45, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Another look at traffic on your Tuesday morning early commute with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
Good morning again. It's 5:51. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. The North Carolina State Emergency Response Commission met on Friday last week to discuss the progress made with Hurricane Helene recovery efforts after 7 months, with the storm's devastating impacts being felt in western North Carolina. Officials giving an outline of what has taken place such far in this entire process, noting over 6,000 people and over 260 pets were rescued, most of that coming within just a few days of the storm impacting western North Carolina. Over 6.7 million cubic yards of storm debris, or the equivalent of over 66,000 dump truck loads, were removed across 22 counties. There were 131 search and rescue teams from North Carolina and other folks across the nation swarming into the state, with over 3,300 individuals taking part in those search and rescue operations. 4,000 National Guard personnel were deployed. 28,000 buildings were searched. Searches were concluded. And unfortunately, the sobering number in all of this, 107 people died, and 5 of those are still missing. Justin Graney, the Chief of External Affairs and Communication with the Division of Emergency Management, told the commissioner that almost $100 million has been allocated from the state's private road and bridge program. That program was established to help property owners repair private roads and bridges damaged during the storm. There are thousands of those private roads and bridges out in western North Carolina. The money came from the Disaster Recovery Act of 2025, Part 1, which allocated an additional $524 million to Hurricane Helene relief in western North Carolina, bringing the General Assembly's total to over $1.4 billion. Democrat Governor Jon Sanders signed the bill, his first into law, back a couple of months ago, right after the General Assembly passed it. So far, 8,000 private roadways and bridge projects have been awarded, with state officials noting that they are working on the construction process for more than 3,000 property owners who have reached out by proceeding to hire more contractors and engineers. In addition to that, almost 4,000 people are being assisted with various needs, from food to housing. Currently, 16 households are still in FEMA transition housing like hotels. So the update showing that a lot of progress has been made over the last 7 months. However, there is still a lot of work to go forward. And with that, we do have some good news out of Washington, D.C. this morning. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, has approved North Carolina's action plan and allocated $1.4 billion for a community development block grant to go towards and help individuals rebuild after Hurricane Helene. That plan was submitted last month, and it can take HUD up to 45 days to approve the plan. It did not take 45 days, and a sign that the agency has acted very quickly in its approval. Stein saying in a press release, quote, "This is great news for western North Carolina. I thank the Trump administration for moving quickly to approve this plan so we can get busy rebuilding people's homes." The action plan outlines some processes that will take place, including providing grants for reconstruction, funding for the construction of units for purchase by low and moderate income households, and the establishment of a small rental and multifamily construction program. The governor's office submitted the plans to HUD for approval after providing a 30-day public comment period that took place throughout the month of March. After Hurricane Helene devastated western North Carolina, we have been working tirelessly to rebuild homes, businesses, and infrastructure across the region, U.S. Senator Ted Budd said in a press release with this announcement. He led North Carolina's entire congressional delegation in writing a letter earlier this month urging the grant to be approved. He continued by saying just last week, Secretary Scott Turner announced North Carolina had been awarded the $1.4 billion grant to jumpstart the rebuilding process. This life-changing investment will provide real relief to thousands of families who suffered from Helene's destruction. I am grateful to the Trump administration for answering our call, acting swiftly, and demonstrating their commitment to our state's recovery. Out of the $1.4 billion that has been allocated from HUD, over $807 million of that will be going to owner-occupied unit reconstruction and rehabilitation. For the most part, that's going to be single-family housing. With that, we did just cover the update from state emergency response officials. The other news that we are tracking as it relates to Helene is that the Federal Emergency Management Agency has rejected North Carolina's request. They did that earlier this month to maintain a full 100% federal match for the state's continued Helene recovery expenses. However, Governor Josh Stein on Friday did send a letter to FEMA as well as to President Donald Trump urging FEMA at a minimum to continue the 100% federal match for 3 months. His full-on request was 6 months, but said at a minimum 3 months would be better than nothing, noting that the Army Corps of Engineers, who have been tasked with debris removal in the western half of North Carolina, have nearly tripled their rate of overall debris removal over the last couple of weeks, about a 6-week period there, noting that there is still a lot more work and a lot more expense, a lot more cost that will take place if the state has to burden some of those additional costs. A lot of moving parts as it relates to Helene. We'll continue to track the details right here. That's going to do it for a Tuesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We're back with you tomorrow morning, 5 to 6, right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.